Hello everyone and welcome. We have some exciting news today on the upcoming Nintendo Switch 2, coming directly from NVIDIA, the developers of the Switch, new rumors on Breath of the Wild 2, and a little bit different from the usual video. We had a lot of amazing questions sent in from all of you for all of us to answer on our podcast, the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏Gamescast. Sadly, we weren't able to get to a lot of them, so I decided I would answer some of them myself. Beginning with the new Switch console, NVIDIA posted a job listing for what many believe is an upcoming Nintendo console, as Nintendo is the only console manufacturer with NVIDIA hardware, whereas Sony and Microsoft have AMD powering their PlayStations and Xboxes. Even a mid-gen console from them would just be a more powerful or faster version of the same AMD CPU and GPUs they currently have. Or at the very least, it would remain in the same AMD family of architecture. The job listing states, as a valued member of the team, you will be involved in the technical design and implementation of numerous features working in an agile environment. You will write code in C and C++, operating directly on the GPU and low-level driver data structures to enable graphics debugging and profiling. In this role, you can expect to create graphics profiler features for NVIDIA GPUs, enabling developers to achieve higher and more consistent frame rates, implement graphics debugging features by reading, writing GPU registers and memory, and by processing and manipulating GPU commands at the driver level. Work closely with internal and external partners, including other peer organizations within NVIDIA. This isn't the first time NVIDIA or Nintendo has held job listings to work on new consoles that enter development after the Nintendo Switch was announced or released. Though as this one comes from NVIDIA as opposed to Nintendo, there is a minor chance it could be for something else, but again, at the moment, Nintendo is the only company with a console created by NVIDIA. For those interested, when it mentioned low level, what that means is an engine architecture or software of some kind that is able to work a lot closer to the raw performance of the actual hardware or GPU and get as much performance out of it as possible, which is usually much harder when working on PC games, which is why consoles are able to use similar hardware to a PC, yet perform far better than the console's PC equivalent. What I find interesting is create graphics profiler features for NVIDIA GPUs, enabling developers to achieve higher and more consistent frame rates. This could be taken in multiple different ways. Now, I don't know exactly what this means, but what it sounds like to me is that graphics profiler may be giving you a similar option to that of the PlayStation 4 Pro or Xbox One X, where you could choose performance, where you would get more frame rates, or visual clarity, where it would raise the detail or resolution, but you would be playing at 30 frames per second as opposed to 60 frames per second. So maybe this could be a way of giving the old Nintendo Switch games a profile boost on the Switch 2, allowing for a higher resolution mode or a mode with higher frame rate, just as the PlayStation 4 Pro or PlayStation 5 does when playing a PlayStation 4 game. After all, who wouldn't want to play games like Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey at a full 1080p in 60 frames per second? And if this happens to be a 4K console, maybe playing it at an even higher resolution. We will be talking about this more on our podcast, the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏Gamescast, or in another video if more news comes out about a Switch 2 or a new Nintendo console, which seems to be happening more and more often these days, as opposed to before when we would just get rumors from random people. At least now it's coming from actual sources. Now, for Breath of the Wild 2, new rumors suggest multiple playable characters. This is something that has been speculated on ever since Aonuma's interviews, mentioning he would like to see Zelda playable, and even the original Breath of the Wild when it was known as Zelda Wii U, where he stated that he didn't want people to think of it as a single-player experience, whatever that may have meant at the time. But this specific rumor doesn't just stop with Zelda, and pushes the concept of other characters being playable in smaller roles. If true, this makes me think of something that may be similar to how Spirit Tracks allowed us to control Zelda for specific moments, as well as Wind Waker letting you take control of Medli and Makar in the dungeons. And let's not forget Majora's Mask having a small puzzle where you need to play as Kafei. The question most of us will have is, which character would this include if true? Would we be taking control of who some of us refer to as the younger champions, with Yunobo and the rest, or will it be other characters? Fans have shown support for playing as Zelda, and even previous versions of Link, which sadly I don't think will be the case. I just see us having only the one Link we will play as, but with Nintendo wanting to progress the series with new ideas and concepts from new developers to refresh the gameplay, we really don't know what to expect. Previous rumors gave reasons for Breath of the Wild 2 being multiplayer, which would also go along with multiple playable characters, but part of me thinks Nintendo may have gotten that out of their system with Age of Calamity, though it wasn't Nintendo who worked on those games. And it didn't have online multiplayer and technically wasn't even a Zelda game. More of a way to tell a backstory with the champions as the main playable characters. Nintendo themselves had little to do with it. And we still have those interviews where Aonuma and others state they would like to have Zelda as a playable character and were interested in online multiplayer. So maybe this is their chance to do that. What do you all think of this? Which characters, if any, other than Breath of the Wild's Link, would you like to play as? Since this was so short, I thought I would answer a few quick questions asked by some of you for our recent episode of the Hylian Gamescast. I may start doing this for the end of all of the videos that we make. So if you have any questions you would like us to answer on our next video, or the next episode of our Hylian Gamescast, which is live every Thursday at 9:30. This week we will actually be having a guest who works on Breath of the Wild and Age of Calamity. So be sure to join us this Thursday to have your questions answered, or let us know what topics you would like us to discuss. Altogether, we had around 50 questions. First of the 3 that I will do here. The rest we will save for this Thursday's podcast. From Lionos Romans, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do you think there is room in the future for games that fit within the traditional timeline, or will all take place in the post-Breath of the Wild timeline? I think right now Nintendo is working on this, I guess we can call it, for now, a trilogy consisting of Breath of the Wild, Age of Calamity, and Breath of the Wild 2. If Breath of the Wild 2 continues to be incredibly successful, then I imagine they will continue with a Breath of the Wild 3. Because at the end of the day, Nintendo is a business. With Breath of the Wild being the most successful Zelda game, Age of Calamity being the most successful Zelda spin-off game, selling more pre-orders than most traditional Zelda games sold in their entire lifetimes. If Breath of the Wild 2 ends up making Zelda even more popular, then I could easily see Nintendo continuing with that and making a Breath of the Wild 3, or a game strongly tied to Breath of the Wild 1 and 2, instead of risking starting over. An example being Twilight Princess. At the time it was the most successful Zelda game of all time. Nintendo thought Skyward Sword would be even more successful, but it ended up selling way below what they thought it would. I would love to see a Twilight Princess 2 or a game taking place shortly after Twilight Princess 2, similar to Spirit Tracks, taking place after and strongly connecting to Phantom Hourglass and Wind Waker, or how Wind Waker and Twilight Princess itself take place not long after Ocarina of Time. I would just love to see more of Midna, the Twilight Realm, and everything else going on in Hyrule not long after that game. Nakori Gaming asks, I'm really wondering about the delay of Breath of the Wild 2. Do you think they're behind schedule, or are they deciding to implement additional features that may not have been in their original concepts? And do you think it might have anything to do with the Switch's successor? Sorry if it's already been answered by you all previously. I've been working more than usual and haven't been able to keep up with the Hylian Gamescast live streams. I think you are correct on all of this. Yes, I do think it has to do with the Switch's successor. It has definitely been long enough for a successor to the Switch to release. Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess did amazingly well, both being the only games to release around the same time for the old and new console that Nintendo was promoting, both of which becoming the best-selling Zelda games. So just looking at that, I think Nintendo would be more than happy to do it again with a Switch and Switch 2 release. As for them adding in new features, I don't think that they necessarily needed more time to add in new features, but now that they do have that extra time because they possibly want to release it on the Switch 2, they now have time to continue working on it. Even with the Link to the Past, it was originally supposed to be a multiplayer Zelda game where you could play as up to 3 different characters. There's an old interview we covered on our top 5 cancelled Zelda games video, where Miyamoto discusses the game and it sounds completely different than what it ended up being. And he says that the game is completely done, just waiting to release, but they are holding back on the release to give their friends at Square time to successfully promote and market their upcoming game, Dragon Quest. And within that 6 months that they held the game back, they ended up completely changing it from what it originally was. And Miyamoto, as well as Aonuma, are notorious for completely changing stuff around. With Twilight Princess, with less than a year before the game's release, they completely changed the entire beginning of the game, adding in a completely different starting area, completely different first dungeon, and everything. With Breath of the Wild, they completely swapped around Korok Forest and Kakariko Village, so now their locations are exactly where the other used to be. So they could be using this time to completely change certain aspects, as well as to improve what is already there. Our final question comes from Gold Pop-Tart. If there was to be a port of Phantom Hourglass or Spirit Tracks, my favorite game, how would you want it to control? I personally think that having the touchscreen controllers there for handheld would be amazing. But what about docked or tabletop players? Interesting question. I actually have a friend who put together a very, very quick demo for me of Phantom Hourglass, where he ported it to a new engine and gave it traditional controls. I'm sure there are other mods out there that give it traditional controls as well. But if there were to be official remakes or remasters of Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, I think Nintendo would give it traditional controls as well as the original controls for when you are playing in handheld mode, similar to what they did with Skyward Sword HD, keeping the motion controls as well as adapting it as best they could for traditional style controls. Personally, I would love to see it if they remade it as a more 3D Zelda game and it looked like Wind Waker, or just updated the graphics and had it look more like A Link Between Worlds or even Link's Awakening. I think it would be amazing. Well, that's all for now. But I do want to say thank you to some new Patreon supporters. Remember, leave your questions or topics you would like us to discuss in the comments below, and we will get to them on the next video or the next episode of our Hylian Gamescast. Hello everyone. I do want to say thank you to some new Patreon supporters. I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing the same thing at the end of our videos over and over again, so from now on I will try to make the insight for each video new and unique. We do have a few new Patreon supporters here, as well as some older Patreons that have continued to support us. If you have any questions you would like for us to answer, or news and topics you would like us to discuss in a video or our podcast, you can leave them below in the comments, and we will get to as many as we can. And if you are a Patreon supporter, we will guarantee that your answer is moved to the top of the list to be answered or discussed first on our podcast, which happens every Thursday at 9:30 Eastern or 6:30 Pacific. Next Thursday, we may be having one of our friends who has a history of working on the Zelda series coming on our channel. Go ahead and put your guesses on who it may be in the comments below. So a huge thank you to 𝗍𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗆𝗄, someone whose name is only donated to hear Jesse speak my name and then didn't give me his name, Gene Pinna, Disappointment, Joseph Stewart, ZAIN JIWANI, SOBERX, Mr. Monocled Metroid, David Guthman, Zoe M, Natsu, Jesse Wood, Andremoy, Ashton, Justin Clark, Candy, Chad Costin, Largnar, Monica Spath, Lovable Christie, and Gus Calvo. I apologize if I got some of your names wrong. Please comment below, or you can message me directly to correct how I pronounced your name. Thank you all for your support, and I hope these videos keep entertaining everyone.